what's up? It's another episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob, and what I do here is I watch some new movies, and by new movies, I sometimes mean brand new. Other times, I just mean movies that I've never seen, never gotten around to. And if you love movies, I'm sure you have those titles, those eras, those genres that you've just never gotten to, you somehow ignored or overlooked. And so here's a way for me to do that. This episode is primarily going to be about a very specific moment in time. And it started because I just watched this documentary called Brats. And, you know, it's a documentary. It's directed by Andrew McCarthy, an actor who was a part of the Brat Pack in the 1980s. It's a very interesting film, and mostly because it's about Andrew McCarthy kind of going back and revisiting some of the people and some of the moments, some of the experiences from that time. Was that like mid to late 80s, right? And it's strange that he takes up, the whole premise is this is about reckoning with this label, the Brat Pack, which is, of course, it's a play on the Rat Pack, which was a group of actors / celebrities from, was that like the late 50s, 60s, somewhere in there? Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., those guys. This, of course, was meant as a play on that, but it's also got the word brat in it. So it connotes that these actors, maybe they really weren't all that great. Maybe they were kind of hyped up, and maybe it was worth taking them down a peg, you know? I get the idea that someone who has been labeled and has an entire term coined after their friends, their group, their generation, maybe they don't feel like they don't deserve that, or that it's fair, right? And so I get the sense that Andrew McCarthy really wanted to kind of confront this and come to terms with it. I think what this documentary ends up showing us, though, is that he might be one of the only ones that really didn't kind of move on from it. For better or worse, I guess. But it is interesting to see some of the other faces and people who have done work since then, of course, but maybe haven't really had those same heights, right? I mean, the first person that he catches up with is Emilio Estevez. And, that's someone that it is kind of sad to see that his career took a real turn after that. Because this whole thing is based on an article written by a journalist, and it's about Emilio Estevez, not really Andrew McCarthy. Emilio Estevez says, well, look, I'm just going to take my career in a whole different direction. I'm getting out of this type of role or these types of movies, and I'm going to go do other stuff, which makes sense. You have to grow, you have to mature, you have to develop as an artist. And I guess it's kind of a shame because I feel like he had so much potential, and he still does, of course, but the idea of him doing and directing and starring and writing roles and films that were way beyond whatever those mid-80s, teenage, high school, college films, whatever those were, like really do something different. And you could see like little hints of that over the years, whether it was something like a Repo Man or look, he was in the first Mission Impossible movie, and that franchise is still alive and well today. And to think he gets killed off in like the first 10 minutes of that movie, it's kind of sad, because I felt like that, maybe subconsciously for audiences, I feel like that kind of like pushed him out the door. Like, we don't even consider him serious enough of an actor to keep him in the whole movie. And of course, he's done some things since then, but It really feels like he's just removed himself from filmmaking and acting and that whole world entirely. Like he kind of comes to it as like, yeah, man, I had a lot of trouble after that, but I put that in the past. I don't even want to talk about that anymore. And I think that's a key counterpoint to everything, basically the whole premise of this documentary. Like Andrew McCarthy is the one that's like, yeah, I want to revisit this and I want to really work this out and acknowledge it and kind of own it in a way. And yet, as we go through this documentary, he finds other people from this era, from this group. We see Demi Moore, we see Rob Lowe, Ali Sheedy. You know, it's funny because there are a lot of people in this era, in this mid 80s era, who were in this generation that have gone on to be megastars. And they weren't in the Brat Pack necessarily. But look, someone like Robert Downey Jr., he was in a couple of those movies with those actors. But somehow he didn't fall into that. And so, you know, to see Andrew McCarthy take up this whole point of view of, hey, you know, this was unfair and this wasn't deserved, and it's really changed my career in ways that I didn't want it to. Well, I can't necessarily agree with that, you know? And look, at the same time, it's like, I feel like everything I've seen Andrew McCarthy in, I like him in it. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily the roles, but I feel like he brings like a real kind of soulful and even sort of an optimistic slant to a lot of things. And sometimes it's hard to see him in certain roles because it doesn't really fit. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I think there's something very distinct about him as an actor, as a presence. And I do kind of wish he would have been in other types of movies. It does feel like his film career is kind of frozen in that mid to late 80s era. So, you know, is this documentary really, does it really make sense? I'm not entirely sure. On one hand, I get the idea of, hey, you know, this was something that happened back then, and a lot of people, like the world, the public in general, has seemed to have stuck with it, even if it wasn't really fair. I can understand wanting to acknowledge that, but at the same time, it's like you should be the one in control of your career and your life. You shouldn't let something like this dictate how you move in the world. And strangely enough, this whole documentary does kind of lead up to this sit down with David Blum, the journalist who wrote the story, who originally coined the term. And it's a very strange conversation, at least the way it comes off in the film, because it is kind of it starts off with like, hey, you know, we just need to like discuss this and maybe kind of sort it out and maybe figure out how we really feel about it today. Maybe we were young, maybe we didn't really understand what we were doing. And so now's a time where we can maybe reflect and maybe understand a little better how that affects people to either be a part of a crew like that or to write a story about people who are in a crew like that, right? And the journalist David Blum, who I don't follow journalists from that era or pop culture journalists in general, I guess, but he really has like no apologies for what he did. And I'm not saying he has to. I mean, it's editorial license. He can write and say whatever he wants to say. And it's up to the reader, the viewer, to decide if that's fair or if that's accurate or if that's worthy of attention. You know, if it got past an editor, made it into print, and the whole world was able to see it, well, now it's in play. So you just kind of have to go with it. And so for him to not back off of it, all right, that's fine. But I really feel like that wasn't where we were expecting to go. when Andrew McCarthy set out to make this documentary, I really thought he was going to arrive at this conversation, arrive at this moment, and there would be some big kind of, oh, I didn't really understand and I apologize and I would have done it differently or I wouldn't have done it at all. But we don't get that at all. And so it's kind of anticlimactic. It really doesn't work out the way I think we would expect. Now, that's not to say it doesn't make it an interesting documentary still, because I feel like, well, hey, look, that's just the break sometimes. That's how it goes. You don't get your redemption. You don't get your retribution. You don't get that thing that you've kind of been hanging on to for years that you hoped would happen one day. It doesn't always work out like you expect. And, to think all of this is about a term that was coined for this group of actors. And it kind of demeans or diminishes the work that they've done. But at the same time, like, it brought a different level of attention and awareness to who they are and the work that they did. So I don't know. It's a double-edged sword, of course. It's a dilemma. And wisely enough, I think, pretty much every other actor in that group has just moved on, just moved past it. The only two people that aren't in this documentary that I feel like would have maybe added some other insight, or maybe not, but it would have been interesting to kind of get their take on the thing, are Judd Nelson and Molly Ringwald. And so, I don't know. I don't know if they still act. I don't know if they're still out there. And so, look, here's the interesting thing about this documentary. Aside from their kind of interpersonal dynamics and whether who's right or who's wrong or whatever, the thing that I took away from this documentary was like the Brat Pack in that era. It really was like a sea change in popular culture and the types of stories that were being told in film. And so, I was alive during that time. I remember when those movies came out, but I didn't really have context because I didn't really pay attention before that. This era, like the mid to late 80s, I was just coming into like teenage years. And so that's right when I started to pay attention. But I think I just assumed, oh, well, they've always made movies like this all throughout the history of film. There have always been stories about teenagers and high school and young adults and relationships and all that. And this documentary at least kind of reinforced my thought that, yeah, that really was a new thing at that time. Like, there really hadn't been that in the 70s, 60s, any time before that. You didn't have this whole wave of films about young people and basically children, really, as they were coming of age and learning about all the different aspects of life that people struggle with, And so that was the eye-opener for me. It's like, oh, this is the first group, whether it's actors or filmmakers, who approached this and had to deal with the consequences of it. And so, look, it ended up being perfect for this because it gave me a little bit of a guide to some films I hadn't seen before. I had seen so many films from this era in the past. Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Breakfast Club. But there were some that were really, it seems like really key to this whole moment that I had just never seen before. 16 Candles, I only saw here doing Film Street, a year ago or 2 years ago. And that was one that I guess I had heard of forever, but just never sat down to watch it. And so I said, all right, I've got a few more that I need to watch now. I've got some more to add to the list. So what did I do? I used that as my roadmap. Okay, so here I went to go find Pretty in Pink and watch that. And, I really feel, it feels kind of silly to be talking about these films like they're, like people are strangers to them. But very quickly, the premise is Molly Ringwald is a girl named Andy who is in high school, and she has her friend Ducky, who is this guy who's kind of charismatic, but is like totally in the friend zone, right? He's just really, he's in Simp City now, you know? He's just not, he gets no play. He really is her homeboy. And you can tell pretty quickly, like, that's not what he's in it for. Like, he really wants more than that. She's got her eyes on a rich kid named Blaine, who is played by Andrew McCarthy. And he comes into it as someone who sees her for what she is and maybe recognizes that they're in like different classes. Like they just don't roll in the same circles, but he's willing to overlook that. He's willing to see past that and still try and have a relationship with her, right? And so there's a part of this film that is about being that age and learning like your place and your clique and what things you really value in other people and in friendships. And yet at the same time, it's like, it does, as a viewer, it kind of forces you into a decision of, wait, whose side are you on? Are you on Blaine's side or are you on Ducky's side? Who should Andy kind of choose in life? And I guess for so many people in life, that is the decision that you have to face throughout. You know, you really have to make some hard decisions sometimes. And you have to take into account like how it's going to affect someone else, which is really hard to do when you're young. You know, come on, we can all agree on that. When you're a teenager, you're a young adult, it's hard to think, oh, this is maybe going to hurt someone's feelings or this is going to look a certain way to somebody else. You just don't have a sense of that. You're all about yourself. And I get it. So this was actually, I feel like, a real mature way to approach the subject, even though the characters still handle it however they're going to handle it. I'll say this. I mean, this is John Hughes, right? This is his work. And throughout this era, you had like two different lanes of these films. You had films that really focused on comedy, really focused on like hijinks and getting into situations and sort of risque humor and subject matter. And you had other films like these that actually put more of the characters and their feelings up front. Comedy kind of worked its way in as it needed to, but it really was more about the meat of the story. And here, I just feel like this, it's a strange dynamic. And I feel like it's one that now we've seen repeated and kind of copied in so many different ways since then. Maybe if I would have had more of a nostalgic kind of angle here, like if I would have really been attached to this film for all these years since I was this age, I would really identify with it a lot more. I think for me now watching this film, it feels like a little bit childish, and only because it's like once you get past a certain age, you still have to deal with these kinds of things and you still have to work through relationships and decisions, but you have more perspective, you know, you have maybe even a little more confidence in how you go about it. So I don't know. Maybe this is worth watching for younger people. Even though it is kind of dated, it does really feel like it's stuck in the 80s. Maybe there's still some value here. I think by comparison, a film like The Breakfast Club, because even though it's kind of also set in a certain time, it doesn't play with such specifics. It is more about types, right? And like identifying for yourself, like which character would you be? There is an element to The Breakfast Club that I think makes it really just above and beyond all these other films of this generation, of this era, because it does do that thing where it gives you, what is it, 6 characters to choose from? And it does give you something different to work with as a viewer. Because it's not just like you're watching this through the protagonist's eyes and you're seeing their decisions and you're trying to follow and maybe make your own decisions. You know, with the Breakfast Club, you have 6 different characters and they're all different types and they've got all different things that they want either out of life or in the moment. And as a viewer, you're drawn to one of those 6 at any given moment. And by the end of it, I think you're supposed to kind of identify like who would I be in this group? Like, where do I kind of line up? And it's not perfect, of course. You know, the idea is not like I see exactly myself in that character, but it's like, which camp would I probably fall in, you know? And I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It's like The Breakfast Club was that film that, for me at least, it helped me maybe see who I was and then see who I wanted to be. And the interesting thing about Brats, there's a moment where the way I read it was The Breakfast Club and films like this, they even forced you after all this time now to kind of look back and reflect on not only who were you and who did you want to be, but who did you become? Who were you really? You know, I remember watching the film, and this would have been, 85, 86, something like that. I didn't see it in the theaters, but I saw it, I guess, on cable or somewhere on TV. And I just remember at the time thinking, well, I guess I'm just Brian. I'm just kind of the plain kid who just tries to do good in school. And, you know, at that time, because I was young, because I was just coming into that rebellious stage, I'm like, nah, I want to be Bender. He's the badass. He's the one that's really going to, like, you know, make his own way. And we see with both of those characters, with Brian and with Bender, or at least for me, it's like, yeah, they're not really all they turn out to be. They're kind of broken in some ways, and they're dealing with things that they don't know how to deal with yet. And looking back on it now, after so many years, and I haven't watched the film in a minute, but at some point when I watched it maybe 5 years ago and looking back at it, I'm like, wait a minute. I think in some ways, and like I said, this isn't a perfect match, of course, but I think I was probably Allison. You know, the weird kid who just didn't really fit anywhere and kind of didn't even want to be anywhere and didn't really know themselves or what they wanted out of life, but knew that they wanted something that they could be proud of. And over time, and the way this plays out in the film with Allison specifically is like, oh, well, she gets like a makeover, which, you know, honestly, I don't know if that's really the right way. And you probably wouldn't make the film that way today. But the idea, I think, that they're trying to convey is there's growth there and there's an evolution and there's the butterfly that comes out of the cocoon, right? Like this person will become something more than what they are when you first meet them. I was like, I could see that. And honestly, I think that's most people. You know, we're not fully formed at that point in life. And so I always thought that was a strength of The Breakfast Club. That honestly just makes it enduring. Like I can still watch that film today and still find something interesting, something engaging with it. And it's also kind of nostalgic. It makes me reminisce of that time. For younger people, I don't know. I think you could still latch onto the characters and what's happening. You may not have a fondness for that era or like the music or whatever, but there's a lot still in that film that still works today. So look, okay, so back to the new movies, the Brat Pack. So I watched Pretty in Pink and I said, well, wait a minute. There's another film that kept coming up with this group of actors, and that was St. Elmo's Fire. And it's strange because Pretty in Pink came out in 1986. And Andrew McCarthy is in that, and he plays a high school kid, like a senior in high school. In St. Elmo's Fire, this comes out in 1985. Andrew McCarthy plays a college graduate who is like out in the world. And all these characters are. There's like 7 of them. They're having their first real world struggles, whether it's something like you're dealing with your money, your finances, dealing with your career and your goals, friendships, marriages, all those kinds of things. I get what it was going for. I get the themes of it. I think it's a film that probably could be made better today, though. Some of that is because this film is squarely stuck in 1985. And unlike The Breakfast Club or Pretty in Pink or 16 Candles, those films, St. Elmo's Fire was directed by Joel Schumacher, not John Hughes. So there's less of a timeless quality to it. Like, it does feel a little more stylized, a little more locked into that period, whether it's the way people talk or it's the wardrobe. Like, why is everybody in this movie wearing their church clothes? Like, young people don't dress like this. I don't think they did in 1985. I don't think they do for sure today. And even down to the music, there are 2 songs that play throughout this entire movie, and they milk those 2 songs for all they're worth. One is the song St. Elmo's Fire, and the other one is the theme to St. Elmo's Fire. I don't even know what it's called, but it is. I do remember this being like on the radio, both of these songs, and I remember thinking, "Oh, that's a weird song. It doesn't have any lyrics. It doesn't even really sound like pop music or rock music. It's just kind of movie score." And the fact that it just plays throughout this entire movie in every situation they're in different places, like this is just the one song on the radio in this world. It kind of shows through of like, yeah, they didn't really have a lot to work with, I guess. Or they just hung everything on this song. It's distracting, put it that way. It takes you out of scenes. It takes you out of the moment because you're like, I just heard this song. And yet, the performances, the story of this whole thing, I feel like it works on some levels, but it could be done much better and probably even be more timeless. I don't know. I feel like that's one that you really had to have seen when it came out and have like a real connection with it. And that's the other thing, it's acknowledged for a moment in Brats, the documentary. And it's something that if you've seen any of these other films of this era, you start to pick up on. But in this film in particular, for some reason for me, in St. Elmo's Fire, it became so glaringly obvious that there's only young white people in this cast. Like, there are no people of color in this movie. And, for this whole cast and all their strengths and all their types of roles that they've played, and, they know their lanes. But to think like not even one of these characters could have been a person of color. Like, how does that work out? And you can say, well, look, that was the time. That was the thinking, even if it wasn't like malicious or whatever, but like that was just the thinking. Because, there's something that this film also reminded me or kind of opened my eyes to is like, you probably telling a little more than you thought. It's like, well, you didn't really know any people of color, did you? So you didn't think to include them in your story. And I think that's where this thing really kind of hangs in 1985, because here now we're talking almost 40 years later, this film would look entirely different, right? Like the cast, even elements of the story, I'm sure, just cultural differences. Like these 7 characters in this film, they really do live in one world. And it does feel like that. It does feel like you're kind of removed from the actual real world. You're living in your quote unquote real world. So I think there's a disconnect there. It just doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel authentic. I can't really recommend it just on those grounds. Like, it's trying to tackle some interesting subjects, but nah. I think we've seen it done better since then. So the last film I want to get to here is a film that I had never heard of. It's from this era. It's a little bit later. We're talking about 1988. This is Fresh Horses. And it's a reunion of Molly Ringwald and Andrew McCarthy from Pretty in Pink. And it's a very different kind of story. It's a very different kind of dynamic to their relationship. It's about a young man who is engaged to be married. He's in a wealthy family. You know, he lives in that sort of society, that high value lifestyle. And he meets this girl just through chance who, you know, she seems sort of mysterious. She seems sort of broken in a sense, but he's intrigued by her. And he's kind of caught in a spell, you know? And it turns into a relationship. And then he ends up just like dropping the engagement, dropping his family, you know, all of that is like out the window now. He's kind of thrown it all away for this girl that he really doesn't know a lot of things about. And it's not a matter of like, well, he's just like lusting after her. I mean, he sees something in her. He wants to pursue, he wants to go down this road. And yet, you know, Molly Ringwald, I feel like is really walking a line here of like, this doesn't seem like this is the kind of character she would play. Like she's really cast against type, I think, for this character. And I don't know if she entirely pulls it off because there is like an accent in this and there's a brokenness to this character. And then we find out, of course, like there's some real trauma that this character is dealing with, like currently, not like in the past, like childhood stuff. It's like, oh, this character is really in an abusive relationship and maybe it's implied like she was assaulted. And so you're seeing someone who's really dealing with some very deep emotional trauma. And I don't really know if Molly Ringwald pulls that off or not. And maybe that's due to the time. You know, we're talking about the late 80s. So it's like some of the stuff, it just wasn't talked about. And I think this was the film's way of trying to talk about it, but not really being able to go there. You know, because if this film were made today, it would be probably much more explicit, like just in the language that's used. And this young man who is willing to either look past that or to live with that, that says something about that character too, right? And like, why? Why are you chasing this so hard? So, you know, it's funny, like this movie, Fresh Horses, like, it doesn't play like any of these other Brat Pack movies. It doesn't have any comedy in it. It really is kind of a serious drama about these young people who are beyond the coming of age, beyond the learning how to live life. And in some cases, they've probably been through more than they ever expected to go through, right? So it's kind of like on the other side of that. Like this is on the other side of all those other films. And I don't know. It's a very mature take on this story and these characters. I don't know if it really gets there though. It's close. What is interesting though, is that in this film, you know, Andrew McCarthy is kind of the main character here. His buddy is a young Ben Stiller, who tries to bring in some levity, even though I don't know if I'd really call it like comedy, laugh out loud comedy, but he brings a little bit of a lightness to it. But at the same time, like some of his like commentary or his advice to his friend, it's a little problematic. On the other side of it, Molly Ringwald, her abusive husband, boyfriend, whatever, is a young Viggo Mortensen. And he comes into the film as kind of the shark in Jaws. Like, we don't see him for most of the film. And he's kind of talked about. But then when he does come into the film, you're like, oh, these characters think that they're adults. They think they can handle grown-up shit. No, this guy is a grown-up. And he's probably about the same age. But just his physical presence is like, oh no, this is a guy you don't mess with. This is a real guy. And so it's interesting to see them in this movie because this is 1988. I feel like we're still looking at that era of the Brat Pack and those films, those types of stories, and with it, those actors. And in this film, it's like, I've always wondered, where's that line where those people kind of started to move aside and other actors started to come into the fold, like of that age group? Like, where's the next wave at? And strangely enough, this film, I don't assume it was ever like a hit or anything. I've never heard of this before. But this was one of those where I'm like, oh, wait a minute, here's part of the line right here. We're seeing like these two waves or generations of actors crossing paths in this film. And honestly, like, you can tell the difference, I think. Like, you can tell the difference in the scenes that Ben Stiller and Andrew McCarthy have together. Just the acting style, their sort of energy, their approach to their characters. And you can even see it in Andrew McCarthy and Viggo Mortensen and their scenes together, which is, I think, is only a couple scenes, but there's a real different approach to how they move and how they act for the camera. And so, if anything, like, that's an interesting nugget about this film, is that maybe it's one of those that where you see a transition, like another change in these stories and in these films and in the actors that are in them, which is sometimes hard to see. Like, a lot of times you'll see some actors, they just stop being in movies and new actors just start showing up in other movies. You know, one film that always comes to mind as like a great example of this is The Marathon Man, where you have a lauded, a celebrated veteran actor encountering and working against a younger, also celebrated, also lauded, upcoming actor. And when you have Sir Laurence Olivier playing against Dustin Hoffman, and you see that dynamic, and you see even the acting style, it's so stark, like the contrast of it, it's so apparent of like, wait, these guys, they're almost like in two different movies and they're in the same scene together. You know, you go back to another transitional period in film, you look at something like On the Waterfront, same kind of thing. You've got Marlon Brando coming in and he's playing against all these other established character, veteran actors. And you can tell, like, he's doing something different. Like, he's running circles around them just in his approach. It's not like he's overacting or outacting them, but he's like way over here and they're over there doing something else. There are films where you can see a real like crossover point between two generations or two styles of acting. And this is one of them for whatever weird reason. I didn't expect that. I don't know. Maybe that was kind of one of the nails in the coffin for the Brat Pack era, you know? And I really don't, I don't mean to say the Brat Pack as in, I really believe like these actors were not good actors or idiots or actual brats or whatever. But it is strange. Like, it has kind of become a marker for that generation and those types of films. And I say that because it hasn't been repeated. Like, you haven't gotten another wave of films like that. Now, there have been other types of waves that have come through. You talk about comedies, you talk about like the Apatow era, right? Like, they don't make those films anymore. They just really don't. And they are very distinct. They have a very distinct type of cast and a style of comedy. And you really don't see those now. So I don't necessarily say it as a bad thing. It's just a name for it now. And that's where I feel like Andrew McCarthy, you should kind of be able to look at it that way at this point. Of like, it's just a name they gave it. It's like a generational name, like Generation X or Millennials or, whatever we're calling people these days. So anyway, that's it for this episode. I'll come back with something else soon. But if you want to hear some more episodes like this, you can check out filmstreak.com. You can go to the IMDb list. I'll have all of these films, over 450 films now. And you can add them there, watch them, or find out where to watch them. Yeah, just go check some of these out, I guess. If you're from this era and you've seen these films, do I got the wrong take on them? I don't know. Maybe watching them all these years later, it's the wrong way to do it. You got to watch them when they come out. That's always a problem with older films. It's like, I wasn't there when it happened, so it doesn't hit the same way, But anyway, that's the thought today. So until next time, find you a nice, dark, cool theater. Go watch something new.